The Duke of Ashworth held his wife's diary above the crowd like a trophy. "Shall we hear what a plain little wife dreams about?" he laughed, and 200 guests laughed with him. But diaries, like hearts, should never be opened carelessly, because the last page of this one was not written asterisk for asterisk him. It was written asterisk about him. And before the night was over, it would bring the proudest man in England to his knees. The ballroom of Ashworth House glittered that night like a jewel box turned inside out. 1,000 candles burned in the great chandeliers. Champagne flowed. Silk gowns swept across the polished floor, and the orchestra played as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. Margaret, Duchess of Ashworth, stood near the tall windows, half hidden by a marble column exactly where she always stood. 3 years of marriage had taught her that this was her place. Not beside her husband, never beside her husband, just close enough to be seen and far enough to be forgotten. She watched Julian across the room. Even now, even after everything, her foolish heart still lifted a little at the sight of him. The Duke of Ashworth was tall and golden and effortlessly charming, and tonight he was laughing, that easy, careless laugh that had once made her believe he might someday laugh asterisk with asterisk her instead of near her. He was laughing with Lady Vivian. Lady Vivian Carlyle wore crimson because of course she did. She stood with her hand resting on Julian's arm as if it belonged there, as if the plain woman by the window were merely a guest in her own home. All of London knew. The whispers had stopped being whispers months ago. The Duke's mistress. The Duke's real hostess. The poor Duchess, well, what did she expect? A merchant's granddaughter marrying so far above herself. Margaret had learned to let the words roll off her like rain off glass. She had her small dignities, her morning walks, her letters to her aunt by the sea. And she had her diary. It was a simple thing, bound in worn blue leather, and it lived in the locked drawer of her writing desk. Into its pages she poured everything she could not say out loud, every hope, every hurt, every small and stubborn dream. It was the one place in that enormous cold house where her heart was allowed to speak. Which is why, when she saw the little blue book in her husband's hand, there in the middle of the ballroom, the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "No," she whispered. Julian had climbed the 2 steps of the musician's dais, and the orchestra had faltered into silence. He held the diary high, turning it in the candlelight, and his smile was the smile of a man about to be very entertaining at someone else's expense. "Friends," he called out. His voice carried beautifully, it always had. "Friends, I promised you amusement tonight, and I am a man of my word." Beside him, Lady Vivian pressed her fan to her lips, her eyes shining. Later, much later, Margaret would remember that look and understand it. Vivian had found the diary. Vivian had picked the lock of the writing desk. Vivian had placed the little blue book into Julian's hands not an hour ago and whispered, "Wouldn't it be delicious?" But in that moment, Margaret understood nothing except that her heart was about to be read aloud to 200 people. She stepped forward. "Julian," her voice was too quiet. "Julian, please." "Ah, there she is," the Duke cried, spotting her. "My devoted wife. Don't be shy, my dear, you're the author of the evening." Laughter rippled through the crowd, uncertain at first, then bolder. "Shall we hear," Julian said, opening the diary with a flourish, "what a plain little wife dreams about?" And he began to read. "Today my husband smiled at me across the breakfast table. I know it was only because the marmalade pleased him, but I have decided to keep the smile anyway and pretend a little of it was mine." The ballroom roared. "Perhaps one day he will love me. I know it is foolish to hope, but hope is the only thing in this house that belongs entirely to me." More laughter, high and bright and merciless. Lady Vivian laughed loudest of all. Somewhere near the punch bowl, a young baroness laughed so hard she had to be steadied by her escort. Margaret stood in the center of it all and did not move. She did not cry. She did not run. Something strange had happened inside her at the sound of her own words in his mocking voice. Something had gone very quiet and very still, like the sea pulling back from the shore before a great wave. 3 years of loneliness, 3 years of swallowed pride, 3 years of loving a man who could do this. And she felt it all harden inside her chest into something cold and clear and unbreakable. So this is who you are, asterisk, she thought, watching her husband perform her heart for his friends. Thank you for showing me at last. Julian turned the pages carelessly, hunting for better material, wetting his thumb, skimming. There's more, he promised his delighted audience. Pages of it. Let's see, here she writes poetry about my asterisk eyes. He flipped toward the end of the book. And that was the moment the evening changed. Because the last page of Margaret's diary had been written only that morning, in a steady hand, with dry eyes. And it was not a love letter. Julian's voice rang out across the ballroom. By the time anyone reads this, I will have. And then it slowed, stumbled. Stopped. 200 guests watched the Duke of Ashworth's face turn the color of ash. The diary trembled just slightly in his hands. Lady Vivian's fan went still. Somewhere at the edge of the room, a glass was set down, and in the enormous silence, that tiny sound was like a gunshot. The Duke stood frozen on the dais, staring at the final page. And no one in the ballroom was laughing anymore. The silence in the ballroom had a weight to it now. 200 people stood frozen, watching the Duke of Ashworth stare at a single page as if it were a loaded pistol. Lady Vivian recovered first. She laughed a thin, brittle sound and touched his sleeve. Julian, darling, don't stop now. You're keeping us all in suspense. He didn't seem to hear her. Read it, someone called from the back, though the voice had lost its playfulness. Go on, Ashworth, finish. And perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps some part of Julian simply could not believe what his own eyes were telling him unless he heard it spoken aloud. Whatever the reason, the Duke of Ashworth cleared his throat, and in a voice that no longer sounded like his own, he read the last page of his wife's diary to the whole of London society. By the time anyone reads this, I will have left Ashworth House for good. I do not write this page in anger. I write it because someone, someday, deserves to know the truth, and it will not come from my husband's lips because my husband does not know it. Julian's eyes flicked up, found Margaret in the crowd. She stood perfectly still by the marble column, her chin level, her hands folded. She did not look away. He swallowed and read on. 2 years ago, I learned that the Ashworth estate was drowning, gambling debts, loans against loans. The bank was preparing to seize the London house before Christmas. My husband never noticed because men like my husband never look at what bores them, and nothing bores him quite so much as his own accounts, or his own wife. A murmur went through the ballroom like wind through wheat. Julian's knuckles were white against the blue leather. So I did what I could. I sold my pearls first, then the emeralds my grandfather gave me, then piece by piece everything else quietly through an agent so that no one would trace it back to the Ashworth name. For 2 years I have paid this house's debts anonymously. I have kept the creditors from this door 3 times. Tonight's ball, the champagne, the candles, the orchestra playing so beautifully, my husband believes his estate paid for it. It did not. My mother's jewels did. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped audibly. Julian's voice had gone hoarse, but he seemed unable to stop, like a man compelled to finish his own sentencing. I do not want gratitude. I did not do it for gratitude. I did it because 3 years ago I stood in a church and made a promise, and I am the sort of fool who keeps promises even when they are made to someone who never intended to keep his own. But I find I have nothing left to sell. Nothing, except the small hope I have carried in these pages, and I discover tonight that I no longer wish to pay with that. So I am going. Let him keep the house I saved. I will keep only my mother's ring and what remains of my self-respect. Both, at least, are truly mine. Julian lowered the diary. For a long moment, Nobody in the ballroom moved. The candles hissed softly in their sconces. Then near the front of the crowd, a stout, gray-whiskered gentleman in a plain black coat rose slowly from his chair. Mr. Whitmore of Whitmore and Sons, the banking house half of London owed money to and the other half feared. Every head turned. Mr. Whitmore was not a man who attended balls for pleasure. He attended them the way a hawk attends a field. "Your Grace," he said, and it took the room a moment to realize he was not addressing the Duke. He was looking at Margaret. "For 2 years my office has received payments against the Ashworth accounts from an agent who refused to name his client. Considerable payments. Payments that, I confess, kept me from an unpleasant duty on 3 separate occasions." He paused, and his shrewd old eyes were not unkind. "The anonymous payments. Madam, it was you." Margaret held his gaze. It was. 2 words, quiet ones, but they landed on that ballroom like a verdict. And then it began, the terrible, rustling shift of 200 people turning to look at the Duke of Ashworth with entirely new eyes. The man who had climbed a dais to mock his wife's devotion, and had instead read aloud in his own voice the proof that this plain, silent, laughed at woman had been carrying his entire world on her back, in secret, for years, while he spent his evenings draped in crimson silk that did not belong to his wife. Lady Vivian took a small step away from him. It was the smallest movement imaginable. Everyone saw it. "Margaret," Julian's voice cracked across the silence. He came down off the dais, the diary still clutched in his hand, and the crowd parted before him without being asked. No one, it seemed, wished to stand near him. "Margaret, why did you never, you should have told me." "Told you?" For the first time that evening the Duchess of Ashworth smiled. It was a small smile, and it was sadder than weeping. "Your Grace, I wrote you 300 pages." She looked at the diary in his hands. "You only ever read them to laugh." Then Margaret, Duchess of Ashworth, gathered her skirts and sank into a curtsy, deep, graceful, flawless, the curtsy of a queen taking leave of a court that had never deserved her. She rose, turned, and walked the full length of that silent ballroom alone, her footsteps the only sound in the world, past the frozen dancers and the motionless orchestra and the 200 faces that had laughed at her a quarter of an hour ago. At the great doors, she did not look back. The doors closed behind her with a soft, final click, and the Duke of Ashworth stood in the middle of his glittering, borrowed, paid-for ballroom, holding his wife's heart in his hands. 1 page too late. The Duke of Ashworth woke at dawn, which was strange because he never woke at dawn. For a moment he lay staring at the canopy above his bed, trying to understand what had pulled him from sleep. The house was quiet, but it was not the usual quiet of a great house in the early morning, the quiet of maids moving softly and fires being laid. This was a different silence altogether. It was the silence of something missing. He rose, dressed without ringing for his valet, and walked the long corridor to the east wing. He told himself he did not know where his feet were taking him. He knew exactly where they were taking him. The door to the Duchess's room stood open. Julian stopped on the threshold. The bed was made, not slept in, made asterisk, with the careful precision of a woman leaving a room she never intended to see again. The wardrobe doors hung open on emptiness. On the dressing table, laid out in a neat row like soldiers at inspection, sat every piece of jewelry he had ever given her. The sapphire earrings from their first anniversary, the gold bracelet he'd had his secretary choose, the diamond brooch Vivian had once mocked as sweetly modest. All of it left behind, polished even. The only thing missing from that table was a plain silver ring with a small garnet, her mother's ring. The one thing he remembered with a sensation like swallowing glass, that she had called truly mine. "She took the early mail coach, Your Grace." Julian turned. Mrs. Hobbs, the housekeeper, stood in the corridor with her hands folded and her spine very straight. She had been at Ashworth House for 40 years. She had a way of saying "Your Grace" that could mean a dozen different things, and this morning it meant none of them kindly. "The mail coach," Julian repeated. "The Duchess of Ashworth on the * mail coach." "She wouldn't take the carriage, sir. Said it wasn't hers to take." Mrs. Hobbs paused. "She said nothing in this house was." "Where did she go?" "She didn't confide in me, Your Grace." It was a lie, and they both knew it, and they both knew he could not call her on it. Julian looked at the old woman, at the red rims of her eyes, at the set of her jaw, and understood for the first time that the servants had loved his wife. That while he had spent 3 years not noticing Margaret, an entire household had noticed her every single day. "Mrs. Hobbs, if you know." "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" said Mrs. Hobbs, in a voice like a door closing. By afternoon, the story owned London. It moved through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs the way fire moves through dry grass, and with every telling it grew. He read her diary to the whole ballroom. He laughed, my dear, while she stood there. And all the while she'd been selling her own mother's jewels to pay his gambling debts. 2 years, anonymously. And do you know what he was doing while she saved his estate? Do you know who he was doing it with? For 3 years, society had sharpened its wit on plain, quiet Margaret. Now, with the sudden ferocity of a tide turning, it fell upon the Duke. At White's, 2 gentlemen rose and left the card-room when Julian entered. Lord Pemberton, who owed his own comfortable survival to Whitmore's patience, declined a hand of whist with him, declined *, in front of everyone murmuring that he preferred to play with men who understood the value of what they held. An anonymous verse appeared in the evening paper about a peacock who burned his own nest to amuse a crow. Nobody needed the names explained. And Lady Vivian did not call. Vivian, who for 2 years had arrived at Ashworth House 4 afternoons a week, suddenly her carriage was seen everywhere but there. When Julian's note reached her, the reply came back in a hand so composed it might have been rehearsed for weeks. "Dearest, given the circumstances, discretion seems wisest for us both, don't you agree?" He read it twice. Then he stood very still, remembering how the diary had come into his hands at all. "Wouldn't it be delicious, darling? Read us a page or two. What harm could it do?" She had picked the lock of his wife's desk. She had chosen the night, chosen the moment, placed the book in his palm and wound him up like a toy soldier, and he had marched. Why? For amusement, he had believed. But standing alone in his study as the light died, Julian found the question would not lie flat. Vivian was many things. Careless was not one of them. Nothing she did was ever only * for amusement. He was still turning it over when he found himself, near midnight, back in Margaret's empty room with the diary in his hands. He had not meant to read it again. He read it again, from the first page this time, slowly, the way it should have been read. And somewhere past the middle, by the light of a single candle, the Duke of Ashworth noticed something that made him sit up and hold the book closer to the flame. Between one entry and the next, close to the binding, ran a thin, clean edge. Pages had been cut out. Not torn in anger, cut * with a blade carefully so that a careless reader would never notice. He turned the book and found more. 3 places, perhaps 4, whole entries sliced away by a steady hand. Margaret had written something in this diary that she had not been willing to leave behind, something she had removed before walking out of his life. And his wife, he was coming to understand far too late, never did anything without a reason. "What did you know?" Julian whispered to the empty room. "Margaret, what were you carrying alone?" The candle guttered. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a carriage rattled past and faded away. The answer, though he could not yet know it, was already moving quietly against him, and the pages his wife had cut out were the only thing standing between the Duke of Ashworth and ruin. The Duke of Ashworth did not sleep that night. By morning, he had read the diary 3 times through, and each reading was a different kind of punishment. The first time, he had read it for the missing pages. The second time, he had read it for clues to where she had gone. The third time, and this was the reading that broke something open in him, he simply read it as what it was. 3 years of a woman's heart, offered daily to a man who never once turned around. He wrote out today without saying goodbye. I stood at the window like a fool. Tomorrow I will not stand at the window. The next entry, I stood at the window. Julian set the book down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He had married her for her grandfather's fortune. Everyone knew it. She had surely known it, and he had considered his part of the bargain complete when he gave her his name. He had thought her dull because she was quiet. He had thought her cold because she was careful. He had thought her plain because Vivian had said so in that light, amused voice so many times that he had stopped looking with his own eyes. 300 pages. She had told him 300 pages worth of truth, and he had opened the book exactly once to entertain a ballroom. But it was the cut pages that would not let him rest. 4 gaps, he had confirmed, holding each leaf to the candle. 4 places where his wife had taken a blade to her own heart's record and removed something too dangerous to leave behind. The gaps came in a cluster, all within the last 8 months. And on the page just before the first cut, the final surviving line read, I saw something today at Ashworth that I wish I had not seen. I must be certain before I write another word. Whatever she had become certain of filled pages that no longer existed. At 9 o'clock, Julian did something he had not done in 3 years of marriage. He went down to the housekeeper's sitting room, knocked, and asked, not summoned for a word. Mrs. Hobbs received him with the wary courtesy of a border guard. She did not offer tea. I need your help, Julian said. Do you, Your Grace? You know I do. He set the diary on her table gently like something wounded. Pages have been cut out of this book. Something was wrong in this house, something beyond what he stopped, started again plainly. Beyond what I did to her, she discovered something. I think you know what it was. The old housekeeper looked at him for a long moment. 40 years of service had taught her exactly how much a servant could say to a duke, which was almost nothing. But she had helped carry that girl's trunks to the mail coach in the gray dawn, and she had watched her go with dry, terrible eyes, and Mrs. Hobbs was old enough now not to care much what happened to herself. Her Grace came to me in the spring, she said at last. Asked me odd questions. Which rooms Lady Vivian went into when your Grace wasn't at home, whether anyone had been at your study desk, whether the second footman, the one who left us at Michaelmas, sudden-like, whether he'd been hired on someone's recommendation and whose. Julian went very still. Vivian was in my study. More than once, Your Grace. Her Grace watched and wrote things down and grew quieter every week, and one night in October I found her sitting up at 2 in the morning, white as the tablecloth, with papers spread all around her. Mrs. Hobbs's chin trembled just once and steadied. I asked her what was wrong. She said, I remember it exact, she said, Hobbsy, I've found something and I can't tell him. He'd never believe me over them. He'd laugh at me. The old woman's eyes came up and fixed on the Duke, and they did not spare him. She said, they'd make sure he laughed at me. The word landed like a stone in still water. Them, Julian said quietly. They, Mrs. Hobbs, who did she mean? She never said the names, Your Grace. Not to me. She said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. Mrs. Hobbs rose, went to the old dresser in the corner and opened a drawer with a small key from her chatelaine. But the week before she left, she gave me this. Said if she ever sent word for it, I was to bring it to her wherever she was, and if anything should happen to her. The old woman's voice caught on the word. I was to take it to Mr. Whitmore the banker and no one else. No one, she said, especially not. She stopped herself. Especially not me, Julian finished. Mrs. Hobbs did not deny it. She simply held out what she had taken from the drawer, a small sealed packet wrapped in oilcloth, no bigger than a prayer book. On it, in Margaret's neat, steady hand, was written a single line. In the event of my death or disgrace, the truth about the Ashworth succession. Julian stared at the words. The succession. The Ashworth title, the estates, everything which, if he died without a son, passed to his cousin. To Frederick. Frederick, who had introduced him to Lady Vivian at a card party 2 years ago. Frederick, who had laughed the loudest at the ball. Frederick, who had written him so kindly just yesterday. Terrible business, old boy. Do let me help with the estate matters while you weather this. You shouldn't face the creditors alone. The packet sat in the housekeeper's outstretched hands, sealed with his wife's ring, heavy with everything she had carried alone. She made me swear, Your Grace, Mrs. Hobbs said softly. Only her hands or Mr. Whitmore's. I'll not break my word to that girl, not for you, not for anyone. And Julian, staring at the seal he had no right to break, understood at last that the diary in the ballroom had never been the whole story. It had barely been the first page. His wife had not fled his cruelty. His wife had fled a war she had been fighting for him, alone in the dark, a war that was still going on. Lady Vivian Carlyle came back. Julian had not expected it. After her cool little note, discretion seems wisest for us both. He had assumed she would keep her distance until the storm passed, the way she kept her distance from anything unprofitable. But 3 days after Margaret's departure, Vivian's carriage rolled up the drive of Ashworth House as if nothing at all had happened, and Vivian herself swept into the drawing-room in dove-gray mourning colors, almost, chosen with exquisite care, her face arranged into tender concern. "My poor Julian," she breathed, crossing the room with both hands extended. "You look dreadful. Has no one been looking after you?" A week ago he would have found comfort in it. A week ago he had been a different man. Now he watched her the way he had learned, these past 3 sleepless nights, to read the diary slowly, attending to what lay beneath the words. And what he saw was this. Her eyes, in the very first instant before her smile settled, went not to his face. They went to his desk, then to the bookshelves, then back to him. She was looking for something. "Vivian," he said, "your note suggested discretion." "Oh, that." She waved it away and settled onto the settee, arranging her skirts. "I wrote it in a panic, darling, forgive me. The whole town was so ugly that first day, but I've been thinking of nothing but you. That horrible scene, that horrible little asterisk book." She gave a delicate shudder. "You know none of this was your fault. She meant asterisk it to happen exactly that way, you must see that." Julian said nothing. Silence, he was discovering, was a remarkable instrument. His wife had played it for 3 years. "I mean truly," Vivian pressed on, and there it was, the slightest acceleration in her voice, like a card player raising the stakes too eagerly. "Who writes such a thing on the last page of a diary and then leaves it where it may be found? She staged it, Julian. She humiliated asterisk you asterisk." A pause, Featherlight. "What have you done with it, by the way?" "Done with what?" "The diary, darling." "Burned it," Julian said. He watched the words strike her. To her credit, her face barely moved, a flicker, no more, gone in half a heartbeat. But her fan stopped. Her fan stopped for a full second, and in the language of Lady Vivian Carlyle, that was a scream. "Burned it," she repeated lightly, "the whole book. Every page. Was I meant to keep the instrument of my disgrace on my nightstand?" "No, no, of course not. Very wise." The fan resumed its slow rhythm. She laughed, a small silvery sound with nothing inside it. "It's only one here she wrote other things, wild things, accusations. A woman like that, unbalanced, one worries what fiction she might have." Vivian tilted her head, all sympathy. "Did you read it all before it burned? Was there anything strange in it? About anyone we know?" And there it was. Not did she write about me, nothing so clumsy. But the third question in 10 minutes about a dead book, from a woman who had never in 2 years asked what Margaret thought about anything. Julian felt something cold and steady settle over him, and he understood, distantly, that he was learning it from Margaret, this stillness, this patience, this art of watching from behind one's own face. "Strange," he said. "No, sentimental drivel and household sums. Why, what would she have written about you asterisk, Vivian?" "About me?" Vivian laughed again, brilliantly. Heavens, what a thought! Lies, I suppose, the poor jealous creature. I only meant, she rose, gliding to the window, recovering herself in the movement. I worry for you, that's all. Frederick worries too, he says. You've seen Frederick. The pause was a hair too long. One runs into him, everywhere, you know how he is. She turned from the window, radiant again, seamless again. He only wants to help Julian, we both do. You need people you can trust around you now. She stayed another quarter hour, and she was flawless, warm, amusing, dropping Frederick's name twice more, each time stitched to the word trust asterisk. When she rose to leave, she pressed Julian's hand and looked up at him through her lashes. Promise me you won't brood over that woman's scribblings. Whatever venom she wrote, wherever it is, the smallest, softest pause, one last cast of the line, it's best forgotten. Ashes, as you say. Ashes, Julian agreed pleasantly, and walked her to her carriage and smiled and waved. Then he went back into his study, closed the door, and stood a long while looking at nothing. The diary was not ashes. It was locked in the strongbox beneath the floorboards of his dressing room, and beside his heart in his breast pocket was the memory of an oilcloth packet in an old woman's hands, the truth about the Ashworth succession. His wife had cut 4 sections from her diary and vanished. And now his mistress, who had put that diary into his hands in the first place, who had chosen the night and lit the fuse and stood back to watch, had come in morning gray to ask, 3 different ways, whether the pages still existed. He'd never believe me over them. Margaret had told Mrs. Hobbs. They'd make sure he laughed at me. They had made sure he had laughed. It had all gone exactly as designed except for one thing. The last page. Margaret's last page had turned the trap inside out, and now the trappers were nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. What did you see, Margaret? Julian murmured to the empty study. What do they think you can still prove? He sat down at his desk, drew out a sheet of paper, and began a letter to Mr. Whitmore of Whitmore and Sons. The one man in London his wife had trusted with the truth. It was time the Duke of Ashworth learned what everyone else already knew, that the cleverest person who had ever lived in his house had been sleeping down the hall from him for 3 years, and that her enemies were now his. Mr. Whitmore's office smelled of ink, leather, and old money. The banker received the Duke of Ashworth without warmth but without hostility either, the measured courtesy of a man who had seen 3 generations of aristocrats ruin themselves and had stopped being surprised by any of it. I wondered how long you would take, Your Grace, Whitmore said, gesturing to a chair. Sit down. You look like a man who has finally started reading his own ledgers. I've started reading a great many things too late, Julian said. I need to know what my wife knew. You are the only man in London she trusted. Not quite the only one. Whitmore rang a small bell. There is also Mr. Penrose. The side door opened, and a thin, precise little man entered with a portfolio under his arm, a solicitor by the look of him, the kind who wore caution the way other men wore cologne. He regarded Julian with open dislike. Mr. Penrose has served Her Grace's family since her grandfather's day, Whitmore said. When the Duchess left London, she authorized us jointly and in writing to use our judgment about what to disclose, and to whom if circumstances required it. The banker folded his hands. Yesterday, Lord Frederick Ashworth visited this office. He inquired with great delicacy about the possibility of assuming oversight of the Ashworth debts. For the family's protection, he said. Whitmore's eyes were flat. I believe circumstances now require it. Penrose set the portfolio on the desk, untied it, and began, in a dry courtroom voice, to take the Duke of Ashworth's world apart. Your Grace, what did you lose at the tables in the past 2 years, your own estimate? Julian's jaw tightened. 8,000, perhaps 10. 26,000 pounds, said Penrose. You will want to know how it grew so large without your noticing. The answer is that you were meant not to notice. Consider, Your Grace, How your evenings have been arranged since, let us be exact, since the spring of the year before last. Who proposed the deep play at Crockford's? Who introduced you to the private tables where the stakes had no ceiling? Who soothed you when you lost and told you your luck must turn and ordered another bottle? Julian sat very still. He did not need to answer. Every memory had the same two faces in it. Frederick dealing, laughing, asterisk one more hand, old boy, and Vivian at his shoulder. Her hand light on his sleeve, asterisk darling, you can't stop now. The spring before last, Julian said slowly. That's when Frederick introduced me to Lady Vivian. That, said Penrose, is when the enterprise began, though we believe the agreement between them is older. He drew out a paper. Lady Vivian Carlyle, widowed at 26. Her late husband's estate, contrary to general belief, left her with debts, not income, debts which, our inquiries show, have been quietly serviced these 2 years by drafts traceable, through 2 intermediaries, to your cousin. Lord Frederick does not pay women to be charming, your grace. He pays them to be useful, asterisk. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below, a clerk's stool scraped. The design was patient and it was simple, Whitmore took it up. Your cousin is your heir. If you die without a son, everything passes to him, but Frederick is not a murderer. Murder is dangerous and vulgar. Ruin is neither. The plan was to bleed the estate white. The lady's role was twofold, to keep you at the tables and to keep you from your wife's bed. No wife, no son. No son, Frederick inherits all. Meanwhile your debts mount until the banks foreclose, at which point your devoted cousin steps forward, purchases the mortgaged Ashworth lands to keep them in the family, at a fraction of their worth, with money that would have been ready and waiting. You would have ended your days a duke of nothing, in a rented house, and everyone would have said only that poor Ashworth gambled it all away, as gamblers do. And it would have succeeded, Penrose said, 18 months ago, except that the foreclosure never came. The creditors were always mysteriously paid just enough, just in time. 3 times Frederick positioned his funds for the collapse. 3 times the collapse failed to arrive. The solicitor allowed himself the thinnest smile of his profession. It drove them nearly mad, your grace. They could not understand it. They never once suspected the quiet woman by the window, because they had spent 2 years teaching all of London, and that she did not matter. Julian's voice came out rough. How did she find them? Because she was doing the accounts they thought no one read, Whitmore said simply. Your grace, your wife has your grandfather-in-law's head for figures. The old man built a shipping fortune from one leased vessel and he trained her at his knee. When she took over the household books, she found the estate's wounds. When she traced the wounds, she found the pattern. And when she followed the pattern, he nodded at the portfolio, she found the hands making it. Penrose laid them out one by one, like a hand of cards played face-up at last. A letter in Vivian's writing, retrieved from the second footman she had planted in the house and Margaret had quietly dismissed, F. grows impatient. The bank must move by Lady Day or he says the terms change. A page copied from the betting book at Crockford's, showing Frederick's side wagers. The man had been asterisk betting on asterisk his cousin's losses. Records of Vivian's debts and the drafts that paid them. And in Margaret's own neat hand, page after cut-out diary page of dates, sums, names, the missing pages, or fair copies of them, docketed like evidence for a trial. She sat where you are sitting, Whitmore said quietly, in October last at 2 in the afternoon and laid this before us and asked one question. Is it enough to protect him? Not herself, your grace. Him. And I had to tell her the truth, that it was enough to make a scandal but perhaps not enough to make a case. That your cousin would swear the letters were forgeries and the lady would weep and the world would say a jealous, plain, disappointed wife had invented a fantasy to explain her husband's mistress. The old banker held Julian's eyes, and that you, your grace, would very likely be the first to say it. Julian looked down at his hands. He remembered October. He remembered Margaret at breakfast, pale, beginning a sentence, Julian. There is something I must asterisk, and Vivian's note arriving, and himself rising from the table before his wife finished speaking. He remembered, God help him, The ball 2 weeks later when Frederick had toasted the ladies who guard our fortunes, and Vivian had laughed, and Margaret had gone white and left early, and he had apologized to his guests for her asterisk moods. She had not been moody. She had been standing alone on a battlefield, watching the enemy toast their own joke in her home. So she stayed silent, Julian said, and paid, and let me think, his voice failed a moment, let me think she was nothing, to keep the trap from closing on me. Until the trap was used against her instead, Penrose said. We do not believe the ballroom was an accident, Your Grace. The lock on her desk was picked. The book was placed in your hand on the most public night of the season. They had discovered at last where the mysterious payments came from. The diary was meant to finish her, to make her a laughingstock and drive her from London so the last obstacle would remove itself. He paused. In that they succeeded. She is gone. And with her gone, the payments stop, Whitmore finished. The estate has perhaps 4 months, Your Grace. Frederick's funds, I have reason to know, are already positioned. This time there is no one standing in the dark between you and the cliff. Silence settled over the office. Julian rose and walked to the window. Below, the city went about its business, carriages and clerks and money moving in its eternal river, and somewhere beyond it, in a cottage by the sea he had never troubled to know the address of, was a woman with a garnet ring who had carried all of this, all of it, behind a quiet face he had mocked in front of 200 people. Mr. Whitmore, Julian said at last without turning, where is my wife? The banker and the solicitor exchanged a look. Your Grace, Penrose said carefully, the first paper Her Grace signed in this office last week was an instruction regarding a petition of annulment. The second was an instruction that her address be given to no one. He closed the portfolio and tied its cords. She was particular about the wording, not no one but her husband. Especially her husband, Julian said. Her exact words, Your Grace. The village of Saltmere sat where the green hills of Devon ran down to meet the sea, a scatter of whitewashed cottages, a church with a crooked weather vane, and a gray stone harbor where fishing boats knocked gently against their moorings. It took Julian 9 days to find it. Penrose would not tell him. Whitmore would not tell him. Mrs. Hobbs looked at him as if he had asked her to open a grave. In the end, it was the smallest of threads that led him there. A 3-year-old letter in Margaret's writing desk, from an aunt, her mother's sister, signed Your loving Aunt Prudence asterisk. With a smudged postmark he had a Bow Street man study under a glass for 2 hours. Saltmere, Devon. He made the journey alone, on horseback, through 2 days of rain. He could have taken the carriage with the Ashworth crest on its doors. He found he could not bear to. And so it was a wet, mud-splashed, hollow-eyed man, looking very little like the Golden Duke who had held court in a glittering ballroom, who stood at last before a small cottage on the cliff road, where late roses grew over the door and the wind came up off the sea smelling of salt. Through the front window, in the lamplight, he could see her. Margaret sat by the fire with a book in her lap, her hair down over one shoulder, dressed in plain gray wool. She was not reading. She was looking into the flames, and her face. Julian stood in the rain and stared because he could not remember ever once in 3 years simply looking at his wife's face. It was not a plain face. It had never been a plain face. It was a still face, a guarded face, the face of a garrison that had been under siege for years. He had been told it was plain by the woman who was starving it, and he had never checked. He knocked. Footsteps. The door opened, and it was Margaret herself, and for one unguarded instant her eyes went wide, and something moved in them, quick and bright and gone. Then the garrison closed. Your Grace, she said. Not Julian asterisk. 2 words perfectly courteous, and they hit him harder than any insult could have. Behind her, an older woman's voice called from the kitchen, "Who is it, dear?" And Margaret answered without taking her eyes off him. "No one, Aunt Prue, a traveler who's lost his way." "May I come in?" Julian said. "No." The word was quiet and total. She stepped out instead, pulling a shawl about her shoulders, closing the door behind her, and stood with her back to it, placing herself. He realized, between him and the small, warm world she had built in 9 days. The rain had eased to a fine mist. The sea muttered below the cliff. "You should not have come," Margaret said. "Mr. Penrose was given clear instructions." "Penrose kept them. They all kept them, your banker, your solicitor, your housekeeper. You inspire a remarkable loyalty, madam. I had to find you the way strangers find people. It seemed fitting." "What do you want, your grace?" He had rehearsed this for 9 days, through 200 miles of rain, speeches, explanations, defenses. Standing before her, every one of them turned to ash. So he told the truth plainly, the way she had always written it. "I know everything," he said. "Frederick, Vivian, the debts, the design, the footman, the letters. Whitmore and Penrose laid it all before me. I know what you found and what you paid and what you carried and for how long and how alone." His voice roughened. "And I know what I did in that ballroom. Margaret, I have not slept since. I read the diary, all of it, the way it should have been." "You read my diary again." The words cracked across the space between them like ice breaking. Margaret had gone white, not the fragile white of a fainting woman, but the burning white of a fury 3 years deep. "You stood in my aunt's garden," she said very low, "and offered me as contrition that you have now read my private thoughts twice, once for your friend's amusement, once for your own education." She laughed one short, terrible breath of a laugh. "You still don't see it, even now, even here." "Then make me see it." "You read my diary aloud in a ballroom, your grace." Her voice did not rise. That was the worst of it, it did not rise at all. 200 people, my hopes. The things I wrote at 2 in the morning because there was no living soul in that house I could say them to. You held them up like a music hall turn, and you did the voices, Julian. You did an * voice for me. For one instant her composure flickered, and beneath it he saw not anger but the wound itself, bottomless. Then it sealed again. "There is nothing left to read. Do you understand? You read my diary in a ballroom, and now there is nothing written in me at all. Not for you." "Margaret." "Mr. Penrose has the annulment papers drawn." She gathered the shawl tighter, her chin level, her eyes dry. "Grandfather's settlement gives grounds enough, and you will not contest it. You owe me that much, and we both know you owe me a great deal more. Sign them, your grace. Go home. Save your estate or lose it. Marry Lady Vivian or duel Frederick or drown in the Thames of your own choosing." She turned, opened the cottage door, and paused with her hand on the latch. The lamplight from inside caught the small garnet ring, the only thing she had kept. "You came for absolution," Margaret said, not looking back. "But I spent 3 years writing you 300 pages of it, one day at a time. You laughed. I have no pages left." The door closed. The bolt slid home, a small iron sound, very final in the dark. Julian stood in the misting rain for a long time. Below the cliff, the sea rolled and broke and rolled again, vast and indifferent. And behind the curtained window the lamp burned in a warm room he was not allowed to enter, and the Duke of Ashworth, who had never in his life been refused anything, understood at last, completely, what he had spent 3 years refusing her asterisk. He rode back toward London at first light. He did not know, could not know, that he was riding toward a catastrophe. Because in London, Frederick had learned exactly where the missing evidence lay, and had already begun the counterstroke that would put not the Duke, but Margaret herself, in the shadow of a prison cell. Julian returned to London to find the city smiling at him. That was the first warning. Men who had cut him at White's a fortnight ago now nodded. Invitations reappeared on the hall table, and at the center of the thaw, gracious and tireless, was Cousin Frederick, telling everyone everywhere what a wronged man the Duke of Ashworth had been. "I've been setting things right, old boy," Frederick said, arriving uninvited at Ashworth House with the easy warmth of a man who owned the place already. "Someone had to defend the family name while you were traveling." A pause, delicate as a stiletto. "Devon, wasn't it? Wet this time of year. Julian kept his face still. He knows where she is. The truth is coming out at last, Frederick went on, wandering the study, touching things, the globe, the inkstand, the spines of books, the idle inventory of an heir. About the diary, about those famous anonymous payments. People rush to canonize her, of course. Saint Margaret of the Ballroom, he smiled. But saints, when one examines them closely, so rarely survive it. Say what you came to say, Frederick. Only this, cousin. Money flowed through hidden channels for 2 years, out of accounts, through agents, past every proper record. London called it devotion. Frederick stopped at the window, and the lamplight caught something in his face that had waited a long time to show itself. The magistrates may call it something else. Where did a merchant's granddaughter learn to move thousands of pounds invisibly? What else moved through those channels? And the papers she carried off when she fled, private letters, documents in other people's hands, some of them, I'm told, forgeries implicating her betters. He sighed, mournful as an undertaker. Poor creature. A jealous wife, humiliated in public, weaving a fantasy of conspiracies to explain her failed marriage and manufacturing evidence to support it. It's almost a species of madness. One hopes the courts are gentle. There it was, the counterstroke, and it was elegant. Every strength Margaret had would be turned into a charge against her. Her secrecy became concealment. Her financial genius became criminal cunning. Her evidence became forgery. Her silence became guilt. And her word against theirs. A discarded wife against a peer of the realm and a celebrated society beauty. London had already laughed at her once. Frederick was simply inviting it to do so again, this time in a courtroom. You would not dare, Julian said quietly. Frederick's eyebrows rose. I am only repeating what is being said, though I should mention purely as family that an information has already been laid before the magistrates. Sir Giles Merton is looking into it. You remember Sir Giles, he dines with Vivian's people. Warrants are such distressing things, but justice, cousin, justice. At the door he paused, drawing on his gloves, and delivered the true message at last, softly, without the smile. Sign the estate over to my management before quarter-day and persuade your banker friend to surrender whatever stolen papers he's holding, and I imagine all this unpleasantness about your former wife simply evaporates, refuse, and I promise you nothing. He settled his hat. You had the world, Julian, and you threw it away on cards and crimson silk. All I'm doing is picking it up. Good day. Julian went to Whitmore within the hour, and found the banker already grim. He moved faster than I thought, Whitmore said, pushing a letter across the desk. Sir Giles Merton has requested, for now, that this house account for 2 years of anonymous transactions touching the Ashworth debts. The word asterisk forgery appears twice. The word asterisk conspiracy once. Your Grace, understand what they've done. Our evidence against them cannot come out except through the very channels they are now painting as criminal. If Penrose produces those letters in her defense, they will say she forged them and that we laundered her money. They've salted the ground. Then I'll testify. I'll confirm everything, the tables, the debts, Vivian. Testify to what? Whitmore said, not unkindly. That your cousin encouraged you to gamble. Men encourage men to gamble in every club in London. It is not a crime, it is a Tuesday. That your mistress asked questions about a diary. Your Grace, asterisk, everything they did runs through you and you saw none of it. Your testimony proves only that you were blind. The one person who saw it, documented it, dated it, lived asterisk it. The old banker took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Is the person they are about to arrest. The word fell into the office like a stone down a well. There is worse, Whitmore said. Sir Giles's clerk let slip that officers may be sent into Devon. If she is taken there, alone, with no counsel present, a search of the cottage, her papers seized as evidence of forgery, Frederick will have every original document in his hands within the week. He won't even need the trial, though I expect he'd enjoy one. Julian stood at the window. Down in the street, London flowed on, and somewhere in it Vivian was choosing a gown and Frederick was drinking someone's health, And 200 miles away a woman was sitting by a fire in a cottage with roses over the door, believing herself finally safe, while a warrant crept toward her through the rain. She had spent 2 years standing invisibly between him and ruin. No one was standing in front of her asterisk. "Whitmore," Julian said, "the mail coach to Exeter, when does it go?" "Your Grace, if you rush down there now, you lead their watchers straight. They already know where she is. Frederick told me so to my face. It was the whole point of telling me." Julian took up his hat. His hands, he noticed remotely, were perfectly steady, steadier than they had been in weeks. He believes he's holding every card. He's mistaken. There is one card he cannot imagine because a man like Frederick cannot conceive of it being played. And that is a duke, Julian said, on his knees, in public, under oath. He paused at the door. "Send word to Penrose. Tell him to bring everything to Exeter and tell him I said asterisk everything asterisk, his objections included. My cousin wants a trial he can control. We are going to give him one he can't." But the roads were bad with rain that week, and the mail was slow. And when Julian's carriage at last came down the cliff road into Saltmere 3 days later, he saw it from half a mile away and felt the world drop out from under him. 2 officers of the law standing at Aunt Prudence's gate, among the trampled roses. And Margaret between them, chin high, eyes dry, small garnet ring glinting on a hand that did not tremble being led away. The Exeter Assize Court had never in its history been so full. Word had traveled faster than the mail. The diary Duchess, arrested forgery, they say, and the Duke himself come down from London. The gallery groaned with spectators. 2 newspapermen had ridden through the night. Even the ushers craned their necks. Sir Giles Merton presided beside the local magistrates, pink and self-satisfied, having assured Frederick by letter that the preliminary examination would be managed asterisk. Margaret sat where they placed her, hands folded, spine straight, the garnet ring turned inward against her palm. She had spent 2 nights in the keeper's house, spared the common cells only by her rank, which everyone assured her was a mercy. She had not wept. Weeping, she had decided long ago, was a currency, and she would not spend it in front of these people. The case against her unrolled with terrible smoothness. Hidden payments, untraceable agents, documents removed from Ashworth House. A handwriting man, Frederick's handwriting man, prepared to swear the incriminating letters were forged. Counsel for the Crown, well briefed and well paid, painted his portrait for the gallery. A clever, low-born woman, elevated beyond her nature, discarded by her husband, weaving revenge out of ink and paper. Twice the gallery murmured agreement. Vivian, in the 3rd row in dove gray, dabbed her dry eyes at intervals. Frederick sat beside her with the composed sorrow of a mourner at a funeral he had paid for. "The pattern, gentlemen, is plain," Crown Counsel concluded. "Secrecy, cunning, motive. Unless the defense can produce witnesses to these fantastical claims of conspiracy, witnesses other than the accused's own paid servants," a thin smile, "I submit there is ample ground to commit." "There is a witness," said a voice from the back of the court. The Duke of Ashworth came down the center aisle. He had been announced to no one. He had sat unnoticed in the crowd, plainly dressed, for 2 hours. Now the whole room rose in a rustle of astonishment, and Sir Giles half stood. "Your Grace, this is the court had no notice," while at the front, for the first time in 3 years, Julian saw his wife's composure break, not into softness, into alarm. No, her eyes said across the courtroom, "Not like this. You'll ruin yourself." He held her gaze and answered it the only way left to him. He walked to the witness stand and took the oath, and turned to face the room. "My name is Julian Ashworth. I am the 6th Duke of Ashworth, and I ask the court's leave to testify against my own interest, my own family, and my own character." He paused. "It will not take long. None of it reflects well on me." "Your Grace," Sir Giles blurted, "you are not obliged." "I am aware of what I am not obliged to do, Sir Giles. I have spent 3 years doing only what I was not obliged to do. Allow me, once, the alternative. And then, in a level voice, before the packed gallery and the scratching newspapermen and the frozen faces of his cousin and his former mistress, the proudest man in England took himself apart in public. He testified to the gambling, the true figures, table by table, £26,000, and who had guided him to each table. He testified to the mistress by name, without flinching, and to what her late husband's debts were, and who had been quietly paying them and produced Whitmore's tracing of the drafts. He testified to the footman Vivian had planted, to the picked lock on his wife's desk, to the night of the ball. I was handed my wife's private diary by Lady Vivian Carlyle, who suggested it would amuse my guests. It did. I performed my wife's devotion as comedy before 200 people. I did the voices. The gallery, which had laughed at that story for weeks, did not laugh now. I offer this to the court so it may weigh a simple question: whether the woman who wrote those pages, or the people who arranged their reading, had something to hide. Hearsay and self-flagellation, Crown Counsel managed. Moving, Your Grace, but where is the *proof*? The originals of these supposed letters were seized at Saltmere and are in this court's custody, said Penrose, rising, where the Crown's expert calls them forgeries. Very well. He turned to the doors. The defense calls Mrs. Agatha Hobbs. She came up the aisle in her 40-year-old church bonnet, carrying a carpet-bag as if it held the crown jewels, which, in a manner of speaking, it did. Sworn in, she set the bag on the rail and addressed the magistrates as though they were underfootmen caught idling. Her Grace gave me a packet last autumn, sealed, said if trouble ever came I was to take it to Mr. Whitmore the banker and no one else. Well, trouble came. She untied the bag. But my lady is a careful soul, sirs. Before ever she sealed the originals, she had every page of it copied fair, and the copies notarized, dated, witnessed, and stamped by Mr. Crandall, Notary Public of Cheapside, last October, 10 months ago. Out of the carpet-bag came the bundle, ribboned and sealed. So when this gentleman, a nod toward the Crown's expert of the sort she reserved for tradesmen who overcharged, says the papers were forged after the ball out of spite, perhaps he'll explain to the court how my lady forged them 10 months before the ball happened, being as she's clever, but not, I think, a *profit*. The courtroom detonated. Notarized, dated, October. The one word * before kicked the entire Crown theory off its foundations, and every person in the room understood it at once. The letters were real. The dates were real, which meant the conspiracy was real, and it sat in the third row in dove gray and a well-cut blue coat. Every head in the gallery turned as if pulled by a single string. The newspapermen wrote so fast they tore their pages. Vivian had gone the color of candle wax. Frederick was on his feet, saying something about outrage, about family, about lies, but his voice had lost its beautiful ease, and Sir Giles, watching his own career flash before his eyes, was already scrambling backward from the wreck, gaveling for order, declaring the committal proceedings against the Duchess dismissed, entirely dismissed, and ordering the papers impounded for a new inquiry into other parties. In the uproar, Julian stepped down from the stand. He crossed the well of the court to where Margaret stood, free, stunned, the gallery roaring around her, and there, in front of the assembled county, the newspapermen, and the two people who had built their fortune on the certainty that a duke's pride was unbreakable, the 6th Duke of Ashworth went down on his knees. Not to propose. He had no right yet, and he knew it. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, and though he spoke quietly, the room had gone so still that every word carried to the rafters. "I came to say it where I broke it in public under oath in front of witnesses. Margaret, I was blind and I was cruel, and you stood alone between me and ruin for 2 years while I made you a joke. Every laugh I earned at your expense, I return with interest. Let them laugh at me now, kneeling, and let it be printed. It is the only true thing I have left to give you." He looked up. "The annulment papers are signed. Penrose has them. You are free of them and of me. I only wished you to hear once in daylight what I should have said 300 pages ago." He rose, bowed to her, deep, formal, the bow of a man to his sovereign, and walked out of the courtroom alone, through a crowd too astonished to part properly, leaving behind him his ruined cousin, his exposed mistress, a room full of witnesses, and his wife, standing in the wreckage of every trap ever laid for her, staring after him with her hand pressed flat against her heart, where, beneath her palm, folded small and carried for 9 days against all reason and all resolve, lay the one page she had cut from her diary that no lawyer, no banker, and no court had ever seen. The last ball of the London season was held, as it had been for 30 years, at Harrington House, and this year no invitation in England was more coveted, because word had gone round, whispered from drawing room to drawing room, that both asterisk of them would be there. The Duke of Ashworth, and the woman half of London now called, with a reverence that would once have been mockery, the Diary Duchess. The 2 months since Exeter had rearranged the world. Frederick had fled to the continent 1 step ahead of the new inquiry, his London creditors suddenly, mysteriously, all calling their loans at once, in a coordination that bore Mr. Whitmore's fingerprints, picking his estate clean behind him. Lady Vivian's name had vanished from every guest list in England. She had retired, it was said, to a cousin's damp house in the north, where the society papers did not reach. Sir Giles Merton had discovered an urgent passion for early retirement, and Margaret had not gone back to Devon. She had meant to. She told herself so daily. But there had been the inquiry to see through, and Whitmore's accounts to settle, and Aunt Prudence, traitorous, twinkling Aunt Prudence, had announced that the sea air troubled her joints and taken rooms in town for the season. So Margaret stayed in a quiet house in a quiet square, annulled, independent, restored, avenged. And every single day, something arrived from Ashworth House. Not jewels, not flowers, not one word of courtship. He had promised her asterisk nothing asked, and he was keeping it with a discipline she had not known he possessed. Instead, the deed of her mother's jewels, every piece traced through the sale rooms and quietly bought back, one by one over weeks. The household ledgers, submitted monthly for her inspection like a steward's, showing the estate's debts falling under a regime of economy that had London's clubs in disbelief, Ashworth, refusing a card table. And once, only once, a note in his own hand. Mrs. Hobbs asks me to report that the roses you planted by the east wall have taken. I go and look at them more often than I can defend. J. She had thrown it in the fire. She had then sat by the fire until it burned, which took some time, because she had waited until the fire was nearly out. Now she stood at the edge of the Harrington ballroom in deep blue silk, near the tall windows, half shadowed by a column in the old place, out of the old habit, and watched the crowd part and murmur and turn. The Duke of Ashworth had entered, and he was carrying a book. Small, bound in brown leather. Unmistakably to a room that had heard the story 100 times, *A diary*. The murmur swelled and died into a silence so complete that Margaret could hear the candles burn. Julian walked not to the dais. He stopped short of it deliberately on the level floor among the guests, and opened the book, and looked once across the room, straight at her, asking a question with his eyes. She should have turned away. Her hands had gone cold. She did not turn away. 2 seasons ago, Julian said, and his voice carried without effort into every corner, I stood in a ballroom and read aloud from a lady's diary to make her ridiculous. Most of you were there. All of you laughed, but I invited the laughter, so the debt is mine. Tonight I have come to pay it, the same coin, the same forfeit. He lifted the book. This is my diary. I began it the night she left. No one has read it. It goes to whoever wishes to print it when I am done. But first, it will be read aloud to 200 people, so that the scales are level. Turnabout, I'm told, is fair play. And he began to read. Day 1. The house is silent. I keep listening for a step I never once listened for while I could hear it. No one laughed. Day 9. Devon. She would not let me in, and she was right not to. On the ride home, I understood that I have been angry at the rain for 2 days when what I am is ashamed, and the rain at least will stop. Day 30, Whitmore showed me what she paid year by year. I have spent the evening doing a sum of my own, what she asked for in 3 years in return. I have checked the figure 4 times. It is nothing. She asked me for nothing. I gave it faithfully. A sound moved through the ballroom, not laughter. The opposite of laughter, that soft rustling that means 200 people have forgotten to guard their faces. Old Lady Harrington was gripping her lorgnette like a railing. Margaret stood by her column, very straight, and her nails were leaving marks in her palm. Day 61, Julian read, and here his voice, which had held level through all of it, began to fray at the edges. Her diary said, "Perhaps one day he will love me. I know it is foolish to hope. I have thought about those lines every night for 2 months, and tonight I will write the answer here where it can be read out and laughed at, since that is what we do with true things in ballrooms. The answer is that she hoped for the wrong day and the wrong tense. Not one day. Not will. It has already happened. It happened slowly, and then it happened entirely, and the joke, laugh, please. Whenever you're ready, the joke is that it happened only after I had thrown her away. I love her. I love my W." He stopped, because the crowd was parting. Margaret had left her column. She was crossing the ballroom floor alone, through the silence, the whole length of it, past the frozen dancers and the motionless orchestra, exactly as she had once crossed another ballroom in the other direction. And she walked straight up to the Duke of Ashworth and stood before him, chin level, eyes bright and terrible, and held out her hand. "Give it to me," she said. Julian, ashen, closed the diary and placed it in her hand, waited for the fire or the floor or the door. Margaret opened her reticule, put his diary inside it, and drew out, worn at the creases, carried against all reason for 2 months and 9 days, a single folded page. "You read yours," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not, and she had stopped caring who saw. "It's only fair I read mine. The last one I ever wrote in that house. I cut it out the morning I left because it was the one page I couldn't bear anyone to see, least of all you." She unfolded it, and in the silence of the season's last ball, before 200 witnesses, the Duchess read the missing page. "I have burned my hopes and settled my accounts, and tomorrow I leave this house forever, and I find I must write one last true thing before I go, or it will poison me all my life. Here it is. God forgive me, I still love him. I love him despite the ballroom, despite her, despite 3 years of silence at his table. It is the most foolish sentence I have ever written, and it is the truest, and that is precisely why no one may ever, ever read it." She lowered the page. "You wanted the scales level, Your Grace," Margaret said, into the ringing stillness. "There, now we have both been fools in front of everyone." "Margaret," Julian's voice was wreckage. "The annulment, it's done, you're free, I can't ask." "No," she agreed. "You can't." And then slowly, with the whole of London watching, with Mrs. Hobbs sobbing openly and unashamed somewhere by the supper-room doors, the corner of Margaret's mouth curved into the smile from no page of any diary, the one he had never earned at any breakfast table, and she sank before him into a curtsy. Deep, graceful, flawless. The curtsy with which a queen grants a petition. "So I suppose," she said, rising, "I shall have to ask you." For a moment the Duke of Ashworth stood absolutely still, as though the words needed to travel a very great distance to reach him. Then 200 people saw the proudest man in England laugh and break in the same instant, and he caught her hands, both of them, the garnet ring warm under his fingers, and whatever answer he gave was lost forever to history, because the ballroom had erupted, and the orchestra, unbidden, had crashed joyfully into a waltz, and Lady Harrington was striking her cane on the floor and crying, "At last! At last!" with complete disregard for her dignity. They were married quietly, 3 weeks later, in a village church in Devon with a crooked weather vane, Aunt Prudence triumphant in the first pew, Whitmore and Penrose stiff and secretly delighted beside her, and Mrs. Hobbs guarding the register like the crown jewels. And it was noticed, by the very few who were present, that when the moment came for the ring, the Duke did not replace the little garnet. He set the wedding band beside it. 1 year later, the first thing anyone noticed about Ashworth House in the year that followed was the light. It was the same house. The same tall windows, the same marble staircase, the same chandeliers that had once blazed over 200 laughing guests. But something in it had changed at the root, the way a garden changes when someone finally begins to tend it, and visitors, stepping into the great hall, would pause without quite knowing why and look around and say, "How bright it is in here. Was it always so bright?" It had not always been so bright. Mrs. Hobbs could have told them the difference, though she never did, because a housekeeper of 40 years standing does not gossip about her betters. She merely allows certain facts to be observed. And the facts were these. The curtains in the east wing, which had been kept drawn for 3 years over rooms nobody entered, now stood open to the morning sun. Fires were lit in rooms that were actually used. The long dining table, where a duke and a duchess had once sat at opposite ends like two strangers sharing a public coach, had been quietly replaced at her Grace's instruction with a smaller, rounder one, at which two people could not sit far apart even if they tried. They never tried. And in the Duchess's morning room, this was the detail Mrs. Hobbs treasured most, though she would not have admitted it under torture. There stood a writing desk with a little brass lock. The lock had been removed. Her Grace had asked for it herself, the first week after the wedding. The estate carpenter had come up, puzzled with his tools, and taken the lock off the drawer and smoothed the wood over, and asked if her Grace wished a new lock fitted, a better one perhaps after he had gone red, after everything. "No, Mr. Timms," the Duchess had said, "no more locks, that's rather the point." On a bright morning in June, 1 year almost to the week since a courtroom in Exeter had turned the world the right way up, Margaret, Duchess of Ashworth, sat at that unlocked desk with a cup of chocolate going cold at her elbow, and cheated. She was reading yesterday's page of the diary. This was, strictly speaking, against the rules. The rules of the diary, their diary, the fat green-bound volume that had replaced both the burned blue book of her memory and the brown one from the Harrington ball, had been established on the first night of their marriage, in the small inn at Saltmere with the sound of the sea coming through the window, and they were simple. 1 book, 2 hands. Each of them wrote when they pleased, whatever they pleased, and neither was ever obliged to show the other what they'd written. But the book lived on the desk, open to the world, unlocked, unhidden, and anything in it might be read by the other at any hour of any day. "It seems a dangerous arrangement," Julian had said that first night, turning the blank book over in his hands. "Suppose I write something foolish." "You will," Margaret had said, "frequently. So shall I. That's the arrangement, Julian, the foolishness in daylight, all of it. I spent 3 years hiding my heart in a locked drawer, and you spent 3 years never wondering what was in it, and look where we—" And then she had not finished the sentence, because he had taken her face in his hands and finished it another way. So the book stayed open, and they wrote. He wrote the way he did everything in that first year, clumsily at the start, then with a growing, startling honesty that sometimes made her put the book down and stare out the window until her eyes stopped stinging. M corrected Whitmore's arithmetic today in front of both clerks. Whitmore looked like a man watching a sunrise. "I have married a mind twice the size of my own, and I find that what I feel about this is not injured pride, but something embarrassingly close to boasting." He wrote about the estate, about the accounts he now kept with the passionate exactness of a reformed sinner, about his nightmares. He still had them sometimes, of a ballroom and a small blue book and laughter, and about the roses by the east wall, which had spread along the whole border now, stubborn and thriving, like certain other things that had been planted in poor soil and survived. And she wrote too, small things mostly, because she had learned that the small things were the true ones. He waited for me at breakfast today, although the eggs went cold. 3 years he never waited. The eggs were dreadful. I have never enjoyed a breakfast more. Yesterday's entry, the one she was cheating by rereading now, was in Julian's hand, and it was one line only. 1 year tomorrow since Exeter. I have asked Hobbs to prepare the ballroom. There is something I mean to do, and this time, for the first time in the history of this family, a duke is going to ask permission first. Margaret set down the book and looked out the window at the June morning, and smiled the smile that appeared in no ledger and no court record, and touched, briefly, the place where her stays had lately begun to feel a little snug, and the secret beneath it that she had been carrying, hugging to herself, for 6 delicious weeks. 2, she thought, could play at surprises. The year had been kind, though kind was perhaps the wrong word. The year had been asterisk, just asterisk, which was rarer and better. Frederick had reached the continent, but the continent, it developed, had been warned. Mr. Whitmore's correspondents were everywhere that money was lent, and a man who has been publicly exposed conspiring to defraud his own family makes an unattractive client. The letters found their way from banking house to banking house, Vienna, Paris, Rome, always arriving somehow, a week before Frederick did. He had settled at last in a small spa town in the German states, in rented rooms, living carefully on an allowance which, and this was the detail that had made all London gasp when it emerged, was paid to him quarterly by the Ashworth estate. Julian had insisted on it. Margaret, to everyone's astonishment, had agreed, and had then set the amount herself to the shilling. "It's enough to live on decently," she had explained to a bewildered Whitmore, "and not enough for a single hand of cards at any respectable table. He'll receive it every quarter-day for the rest of his life, from the family he tried to ruin, and every quarter-day he'll have to sign a receipt for it. Starving him would be cruelty, Mr. Whitmore. This is arithmetic asterisk." And Whitmore, who had buried 2 wives and outlasted 3 chancellors and thought nothing in finance could delight him any more, had gone home and told his clerks that the Duchess of Ashworth had invented a form of revenge that compounded quarterly. Of Lady Vivian there was less to tell, which was itself the punishment. The North had kept her. Society's memory, endless where scandal amused it, is pitiless where scandal has ceased to amuse, and Vivian's great currency, the only one she had ever traded in, had been being talked about. Nobody talked about her now. A gentleman lately returned from Harrogate reported having seen her at an assembly there, in a May-Dover gown 2 seasons old, being gracious to the wife of a wool merchant. The story raised, in London's drawing rooms, not even a laugh, only a small silence and a turning to more interesting subjects. Sir Giles Merton grew roses, badly in Surrey. And in Devon, in a cottage on the Cliff Road, Aunt Prudence's joints had made a remarkable recovery the moment the wedding was over. Sea air, she said, though she was persuaded up to town twice a year, where she had struck up with old Lady Harrington, a friendship so conspiratorial that Julian swore the 2 of them were the true government of England, and Margaret did not entirely argue. The ballroom of Ashworth House had not been used since the night of the diary. This was not spoken of. It had simply happened. Dinners, yes, and music in the long gallery, and at Christmas a party for the tenants that had ended with the Duke of Ashworth dancing a country reel with Mrs. Hobbs while the household roared, but the ballroom's great doors had stayed shut, by unspoken agreement, all year. Some rooms need time before they can be forgiven. Now, on the evening of the anniversary of Exeter, the doors stood open, and the 1,000 candles were lit, and Margaret paused on the threshold in dove-blue silk and felt her heart perform a small, complicated maneuver. The room was full, but not with 200 glittering strangers. Julian had made his own guest list for this night, and it was the strangest assembly the ballroom of Ashworth House had ever held. Mr. Whitmore stood by the fireplace in his plain black coat, drinking the second-best sherry with the expression of a man auditing it. Mr. Penrose had brought his wife, a small, round, cheerful woman who was the talking half of the marriage. Aunt Prudence and Lady Harrington had established a court of 2 chairs and were receiving. The vicar of Saltmere was there, having been fetched the whole way by the Ashworth carriage, and Mr. Timms the carpenter in his Sunday coat, and the whole upper household down to the newest kitchen maid, scrubbed and shining and terrified with joy. And by the supper-room doors, in a new lace cap that Margaret had given her, and that she had declared asterisk far too fine and had worn every day since, stood Mrs. Agatha Hobbs. 40 people, perhaps, in a room built for 400. Every one of them had stood by Margaret when it cost something to do it. "You see the principle," Julian said quietly, appearing at her side, offering his arm. "I have had a year to think about what a ballroom is for. I got it wrong the first time. A ballroom, it turns out, is not for the people who laugh at what you read out in it." He looked down at her. "It's for the people who wouldn't." There was music. The estate had its own small orchestra now, the second footman being a fiddler of ferocious talent. And there was supper, and Lady Harrington's cane kept time on the floor, and at 10 o'clock, when the room was warm and golden and nobody's guard was up, the Duke of Ashworth stepped into the middle of the floor with a book in his hand. The fat green book, their book. The room went still, but it was a different stillness from that other night's, the way a hearth fire is different from a lightning strike. Margaret, by the window, felt Mrs. Hobbs materialize at her shoulder and felt the old woman's hand find hers and hold it. "A year ago tonight," Julian said, "in a courtroom in Exeter I read out the worst of myself in public, and it was the best thing I have ever done. It gave me a superstition. Certain things, I now believe, only become entirely true when they are said in front of witnesses." He opened the book. "My wife and I keep a diary between us. The rule is that either may read what the other writes. Tonight I claim the rule in front of you all. Margaret, forgive me. I found it this afternoon, and I ask her permission." He looked at her across the room, and his voice was suddenly not steady at all. "I ask her permission to read one page aloud." Every head turned to the Duchess. Margaret stood very straight, and her cheeks were burning, and her eyes were bright, and Mrs. Hobbs's grip on her hand had become something in the nature of a vice. She had written the page that morning. She had left the book on the desk, open, unlocked, unhidden. "That's rather the point." "Permission granted, Your Grace," said Margaret, Duchess of Ashworth, in a voice that carried clear and warm to the rafters. "Read it properly, mind. No voices." And so, in the same ballroom where he had once read her heart out as comedy, before 40 true witnesses and 1,000 candles, Julian read out 4 lines in his wife's neat, steady hand. And this was the second time in its history that a page of Margaret's diary silenced the ballroom of Ashworth House, and the last, and the best. "An entry for my husband to find. There is to be a new name in the family Bible by spring. I have known for 6 weeks and kept it for tonight because you are not the only one in this house with a sense of occasion. Happy anniversary, Julian. Come and dance with me." For a moment the Duke of Ashworth stood absolutely motionless in the middle of his own ballroom, staring at the page, doing, as he later freely admitted, the sum 3 times, like Whitmore checking a figure too good to be true. Then the book fell, frankly and completely disregarded, onto a chair, and the proudest man in England crossed his ballroom floor at something perilously close to a run, and caught his wife up, and the room came down around them. Lady Harrington's cane hammering the floor, Aunt Prudence weeping magnificently, Penrose's wife embracing the vicar, Whitmore shaking hands with the carpenter, the fiddler footman launching without orders into the wildest reel in his repertoire, and Mrs. Agatha Hobbs, 40 years in service and dignity unbroken through fire and flood, sobbing like a girl into her far too fine new lace cap, and not caring one straw who saw. They danced. Everyone danced. The Duke danced with the Duchess, and then with Mrs. Hobbs, and then with the kitchen maid, who did not sleep for 2 days afterward. The Duchess danced with Whitmore, who revealed a shocking secret competence at the quadrille. And at midnight Julian and Margaret stood together at the tall windows in the old place by the marble column, reclaimed now, like everything else, and looked out at the summer dark. "A name in the family Bible," Julian said, for perhaps the 15th time. "By spring. By spring." "If it's a girl," he said, "I should like that is. I've been thinking for the last 2 hours, which is to say not thinking at all. I should like her to have your mother's name." Margaret turned the little garnet ring on her finger beside the gold band, and did not trust herself to answer that in words, so she answered it another way, and the marble column, which had seen a great deal in its time, saw that too. The child came with the spring, a daughter, dark-haired, loud, and entirely healthy, and was carried to her christening in Saltmere Church under the crooked weather vane, wrapped in lace that Mrs. Hobbs had been secretly making since approximately 1 hour after the announcement. She was given her grandmother's name, and Aunt Prudence and Mr. Whitmore stood as godparents, an alliance of sea air and compound interest that boded formidably for the child's future. And on a quiet evening in May, when the house had settled and the baby slept and the roses by the east wall were budding along the whole length of the border, Margaret sat at the unlocked desk in the last of the light, and drew the green book toward her, and dipped her pen. 3 years ago, a lonely young woman in this house had written, "Today my husband smiled at me. I know it was only because the marmalade pleased him, but I have decided to keep the smile anyway and pretend a little of it was mine." The whole world had heard those words read out as a joke. She had thought once that they were the saddest lines she would ever write. She turned to a fresh page and wrote the answer to them, 12 words, in a neat, steady hand in a book with no lock, in a house full of light. "Today my husband smiled at me, and now I know he loves me." She sat back. Downstairs, faintly, she could hear Julian in the nursery doorway, informing his daughter, who was 3 weeks old and asleep, of the evening's estate business, in the confidential tone of a man reporting to his superior officer. Margaret listened, and laughed softly to herself, and left the book lying open on the desk where anyone might read it. Because some diaries, it turns out, are meant to be read aloud after all. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.